Rather than frustrated, isn't he ashamed that millions of people in this country and around the world believe there is an inherent racism at the heart of British foreign policy in this regard, that says that Palestinian lives matter much less than any other lives, or indeed than Israeli lives? And if he is ashamed, and the Honourable Lady who sits next to him has taken these statements before, why are they hanging onto their red folders? Why aren't they standing down and compelling the government to actually do something active and physical to save these lives?
And, Mr. Speaker, his previous answer to UNRWA is simply not good enough. Where is the urgency? Where is the urgency of doing something urgently about it, making an assessment what it means if there's no more humanitarian aid being delivered through UNRWA?
We have an Israeli ambassador who's an advocate of a greater Israel, refuses to recognise the Palestinian state, defies all the UN resolutions that have been passed about how we can secure that peace, and she still remains in this country. Why aren't we expelling the Israeli ambassador?
Chair of the Entitled Select Committee, Sarah Chair.
Thank you for granting this question, and I really thank the member from West Abingdon for all the work she's done trying to highlight the horrors that are going on. I'm interested in what assessment the government has made of Israel's actions in the Netzarim corridor, which Israel has cleared of Palestinian civilians in order to construct military roads and positions. One senior Israeli official told Haaretz that the area had been designated as a kill zone, with anyone who enters being shot. The same officer told Haaretz that civilians were knowingly killed and later designated as terrorists, with competitions between military units regarding who can cause the most casualties. I wonder what assessment the Minister has made of these alleged war crimes, what we're doing to document them and to stop them.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as you would expect, my department takes careful stock of all of the reports, including the ones that my right honourable friend mentions, and we include it as part of the regular assessments. We concluded one of those assessments recently, and I updated the House on that.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Colin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Oxford, West and Abingdon, for her powerful and sustained advocacy for Palestinians. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, the situation in northern Gaza is utterly dire. We need to see action from the government in the face of a dreadful and worsening situation. At the end of December, Israeli forces closed Kamal Adwan, the last functional hospital in northern Gaza, forcibly removed patients and detained its director, Dr. Abu Safia. The Minister says that he has raised this with the Deputy Foreign Minister and the Ambassador, but I wish to ask him, what consequences did he spell out to them if Israel fails to meet their obligations to protect civilians and sustain access to healthcare in northern Gaza? The Minister also referred to Israeli airstrikes in the allegedly safe zone. I've on previous occasions asked the Foreign Secretary to look again at a full ban on arms sales. Will the Minister now do so? We will only see an end to violence with a ceasefire, so can the Minister update the House on progress towards the release of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas and towards a lasting ceasefire? And finally, Mr. Speaker, in light of deep concerns about the direction this conflict might take under the second Trump presidency, and following remarks made by Israeli government ministers about annexation and actions on the ground in the West Bank to extend illegal settlements, does the Foreign Secretary agree that does the Minister agree that now is the moment to recognise Palestine on the 1967 borders?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Taking the honourable member's questions in turn. So on arms sales, we have been clear, and I'm pleased to reiterate that clarity today. We have taken steps in relation to the weapons at issue in Gaza. We keep that under regular review, but we have taken clear, principled steps. If the question relates to the F-35 programme, I am happy to reiterate that we carved out that provision because there was no other way in order to meet our obligations in relation to international peace and security. That remains the position, and in relation to a ceasefire, efforts are ongoing. We hope to see an early resolution, but we have been here, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, many times before. These are incredibly fraught talks. Flexibility needs to be shown on all sides. The violence has gone on for far too long. We continue to call for an immediate ceasefire, as we have since we became the government. I have raised the situation in Kamal Adwan and the wider question that the provision of healthcare raises in northern Gaza. I have been clear, Mr. Speaker, with the Israeli government, the obligations that fall upon them under international humanitarian law in order to ensure proper medical assistance is available to Gazan people. They are entitled to that assistance, and those obligations fall clearly under international law, and we are clear with the Israelis on those questions, and including what the consequences are internationally if they are not met. The member also raises questions about legal settlements, and I am pleased to repeat the UK's position. We do not support annexation of Gaza. We support the 1967 boundaries, and we deplore illegal settlements, and that is why we took sanctions against them late last year.
Patricia Fergus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for bringing this urgent question today. It is indeed urgent. The UK at the UN called for Israel to abide by UNSC Resolution 2286 on the protection of civilians and health care. It is clear Israel is not abiding by that resolution. So, the words having been uttered and ignored, what action will the government now take to ensure Israel is held to account for its actions?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we could not be more clear, publicly and privately, what expectations fall on Israel in relation to health provision. I have raised these issues, the Foreign Secretary has raised these issues, my ministerial colleagues have raised these issues. It is a source of enormous frustration to the ministerial team that we are still, this long into the conflict, still having to raise these issues, and we will continue to do so until there is some resolution, and that resolution must enable greater health care for the Palestinians of Gaza and the wider region.
Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, you and I have been through this rigmarole many times over the last 14 months, and I was going to ask today about the fate of Dr. Abu Safir, but I think we all know what's going to happen to him. I was going to ask about the freezing babies, the babies that are freezing to death while blankets are being denied entry into Gaza, but I don't think we're going to be able to do much about that, or indeed the denial of access for cancer medication or anaesthetic or crutches, or the bombing of every single hospital. The Minister said he and his team are frustrated. But given the partial application of international law and the government's unwillingness to take any significant steps to either compel the imposition of a ceasefire or compliance with international law, rather than frustrated, isn't he ashamed that millions of people in this country and around the world believe there is an inherent racism at the heart of British foreign policy in this regard, that says that Palestinian lives matter much less than any other lives, or indeed than Israeli lives? And if he is ashamed, and the Honourable Lady who sits next to him has taken these statements before, why are they hanging on to their red folders? Why aren't they standing down and compelling the government to actually do something active and physical to save these lives?
Minister.
There are places, Mr. Speaker, I will take lessons about shame, but it is not from the benches opposite me, particularly not on this issue. If the benches opposite me want to give me a hard time about what is being done in relation to the people in Gaza, I would turn to your own record, whether it's in relation to aid into Gaza, whether it's in relation to the ICC, the ICJ. These are sober issues. We deal with them with the sobriety that they require, and I would particularly, from the opposite benches, appreciate questions of that tone.
Mrs. Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In November, the IDF made an official statement that it is getting closer to the complete evacuation of northern Gaza, and Palestinians will not be permitted to return home. In December, Doctors Without Borders reported on the clear signs of ethnic cleansing in the north of Gaza, and only last week the residents of Beit Hanun were ordered to leave the area. Ethnic cleansing is taking place before our very own eyes, and the world remains silent. Will the Minister confirm that Israel must allow Palestinians to return to northern Gaza, and that any settlements there would be illegal?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that it is the view of the government that Palestinians must be able to travel freely between North and South Gaza, that there can be no further illegal settlements, and that we will continue to condemn that in the way that we do in the West Bank. There must be no annexation of Gaza.
Mr Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Government acknowledge that what is happening in northern Gaza is a campaign of ethnic cleansing? And if he doesn't, what would he call it?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we have been incredibly clear about the position in northern Gaza, about our deep concerns, about both in relation to healthcare provision, in relation to aid going into the area, about the targeting of healthcare professionals, about the detentions, the importance of transparency of people where they have been taken, ensuring that they have adequate rights to their lawyer, that the ICRC can see people. The situation in northern Gaza is close to our minds. We have commented extensively throughout the winter period, and we will continue to do so.
Sam Rushworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Having listened as a member of the International Development Committee to evidence on Gaza, it is now clear that there have been egregious breaches of international law. Whilst I don't doubt the integrity and sincerity of the honourable gentleman, it's also clear to me that the actions taken so far by this government have either not shifted the dial an inch, or how much worse would it be? And I'd be interested to know, besides rhetorically supporting an international court, what this government will do to help to gather evidence, to protect witnesses, and to make sure that there is justice and accountability.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question. I would take issue with it, though, which is that this government has done more than rhetoric, whether it is the £13 million of funding that we announced in December, the £112 million of funding for the occupied Palestinian territories, the quite different position we have taken on questions of international justice compared to our predecessors, or the extensive funding that we provide to the ICC each year to ensure that they can do their work. And I just want to be clear about that. We do not specify that funding in relation to Gaza. We give that funding to the ICC so they can pursue their work without fear or favour globally, and we will continue to do so.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The aggressors in this situation are the terrorists in Hamas. The ones that took and continue to hold hostages are the terrorists in Hamas. Therefore, would the Minister agree with me that the only concrete way to end this horror is for those terrorists in Hamas to release those remaining hostages, and talk of an unconditional ceasefire gives those terrorists no incentive to free those innocent people?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, Hamas are terrorists and they should release their hostages immediately.
Alice MacDonald.
Speaker, there are an estimated 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, with more than 180 births taking place every day. None of us can imagine the hell of Gaza, let alone being pregnant in it. Ultimately, we need a ceasefire, but the health system is on its knees. So please, can the Minister expand on whether you've raised specifically, he has raised specifically, the issue of women and girls, and how our aid is being targeted to support access to sexual and reproductive health services?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we have raised these issues specifically, but I want to be straightforward with the House, which is we are clear insufficient aid of all kinds is getting into Gaza. So on almost any question that the House might put to me, there is insufficient aid, there is insufficient equipment, and there are insufficient provisions for people to be existing in Gaza under these conditions, and we will continue to raise that with force with the Israelis for as long as that situation remains.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Exactly a year ago, Lord Cameron, when talking about the situation in northern Gaza, told the Foreign Affairs Committee that the conflict now is effectively over there. Unfortunately, no one seems to have told Tel Aviv, because there are still babies freezing to death and the last hospital has been destroyed. And in that year, while the faces on the government benches may have changed, the UK's complicity in the mass killing of Palestinians remains as it has been for the past year. Given that nothing has changed, does the Minister genuinely believe that in another year from now he'll be able to say that continuing to arm the IDF was both moral and legal?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, if words are to have meaning, clearly our policy is different from those on the benches opposite us, as I think they would accept. I do not want to see this conflict to continue for another year. The Palestinians cannot wait. We are doing everything we can. We have been calling for an immediate ceasefire since we became the government. We will continue to take steps to try and advance it.
Dr. Rosanna Allen-Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was left numb by the words a doctor wrote on a whiteboard of the Al-Awda hospital in Gaza before he was killed by an Israeli airstrike. Whoever stays until the end will tell the story. We did what we could. Please remember us. We need to know we did all that we could. I know the Minister and his department are pulling every lever available, but please, can we have an extra push to get the ceasefire deal over the line? We need to put an end to this horror.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for the question, and I remember those words from the whiteboard myself, and we must and we will spare no effort and strain every sinew to try and do what we can to advance the ceasefire as quickly as possible. It is already far too late.
Okay. Monica Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased that the Prime Minister has recently met with the UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini and pledged further funding. But in 3 weeks, Knesset legislation to ban UNRWA comes into force. Lazzarini has said that dismantling UNRWA will collapse the UN humanitarian response in Gaza, and that the entire population of Gaza fears their only remaining lifeline will be cut. He also commented that since the beginning of the war in Gaza, Israeli officials have described dismantling UNRWA as a war goal. So will the Minister set out what consequential steps the UK will take if this comes into effect?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister was the first Prime Minister to meet Commissioner General of UNRWA. He did so in a week where we had announced further funding for UNRWA. We have raised these vital questions with the Israeli government. We did so over the course of the break. I myself have met Commissioner General Lazzarini, and I'll be saying more about UNRWA in the coming weeks if we are not in a position to see that the Israelis are taking the action necessary to ensure the sustained and continued support that Palestinians require and which only UNRWA can provide.
Abdul Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not one single hospital now operates in northern Gaza. Healthcare staff continue to be targeted, resulting in even more death of innocent civilians. We've heard the Minister, but surely what we're doing is not enough. What is it that you can do to stop this systematic dismantling of the hospitals in Gaza?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's right. What we have done is not enough, and you know it is not enough. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, you know that it's not enough because the provision is so poor in northern Gaza. We are distressed by the scenes in northern Gaza. We are distressed by the circumstances which the honourable member and many others have described, and we will continue to work as hard as we can, both in relation to UNRWA and directly with the Israeli government, to try and ensure that the aid provision, including in relation to medical provision, is provided with urgency, and the current situation is not good enough.
Rob Pritchard.
Speaker, of course Israel has the right to defend itself, but surely the life of a Palestinian child is as precious as the life of an Israeli child. And it is a breach of international humanitarian law for fuel and for food and for energy to be cut off from the ordinary Palestinians. And would the Minister just confirm to the House that the UK government has an independent foreign policy when it comes to Israel and Gaza, and it is a foreign policy set in Whitehall, not in Washington?
Minister.
Britain has an independent foreign policy set by the Ministers of the Foreign Office and the Prime Minister here, and I'm happy to confirm that to the House. Of course, for this government, the value of a Palestinian life is much the same, exactly the same as an Israeli life, and we deplore all of the civilian suffering that we have seen in this conflict, which, as I say, has gone on for far too long.
Mr.
Speaker, thank you for granting this urgent question. One of the most appalling aspects of this conflict has been Israel's reckless disregard for not just civilian life, but for the lives of medical practitioners and of medical patients. Kamal Adwan Hospital, the last major facility within northern Gaza, is now out of service, as has been said already. but patients have been moved to a nearby non-functional and partially destroyed facility at the Indonesian hospital, and they're unable to receive care due to a lack of necessary equipment and supplies. So can the Minister confirm to me that one of the consequences of Israel's action will be that he assesses there has been a clear breach of international law, and that actually a consequence of that will be the continued suspension of weapons sales to Israel when it comes to Gaza?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for the question. We're following this situation closely. I raised the circumstances at the hospitals that he mentioned with the Deputy Foreign Minister on the 23rd of December. We are watching it very closely, and I can confirm that all of the developments in the conflict are considered as part of the regular assessment process and contribute to the assessments that we make.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Report after report from reputable organisations, the most recent being Amnesty International, have concluded that Israel's actions in Gaza are genocidal in nature. The scale of destruction in northern Gaza is now being described as much worse than the destruction in the aftermath of Hiroshima. Will this government now change its former position and identify that Israel's actions in Gaza are indeed genocidal in nature, and what actions will be taken given the grave nature of these facts?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, determinations of genocide and war crimes are properly matters for international courts, and as the House knows, there is an international court process on that question, so I will not comment further on determination questions. What the member asks about what we are doing, let me recap again. We have taken action both in relation to arms, in relation to aid, in relation to diplomatic pressure on the Israelis, and we will continue to do so. The situation in Gaza is intolerable, and we will continue to take steps to try and reduce the suffering.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the difficult position the Minister's in, and he has spoken a number of times to the House specifically on this issue. However, I do have significant sympathy with not just the member for South West Hampshire and the frustration that he and others are expressing. The time now really is for action. Appreciate that we, as a government, have done a lot and were significantly different from the previous government, but that was a very, very low bar. It is important. It is important that this House has its view expressed through Parliament, through the ministers, and in particular, I'd like to know whether the ICJ advisory opinion, which is absolutely crucial to the delivery of a two-state solution to a peace process, has the government finally accepted this? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for the question. I'm always happy to hear the House's view on these issues. I have done so extensively and will continue to do so, and I know the strength of feeling across the House. In relation to the ICJ advisory opinion, we are still considering what was a complex and far-reaching judgment with significant horizontal legal implications as well as in specific relation to this conflict. At the heart of that advisory opinion is a concern about the statement of occupied Palestinian territory, and I am pleased to confirm, Mr. Speaker, that we continue to consider Palestinian territory to be occupied. We continue to take a position consistent with international law, and we continue to condemn illegal settlements, and that is why we took tangible, not just rhetorical, tangible steps against settlements in the West Bank, which were violent and illegal.
Sir Desmond Swain.
The Minister must be aware that there are honourable members on both sides of the House who were equally frustrated with the form of the previous administration as they are with this one. When he says that he's brought pressure to bear on the Israeli authorities, when that pressure manifestly fails to deliver, is there a plan?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I pay tribute to the honourable member, who was also a Foreign Office Minister, and I hosted him in Afghanistan, which I'm sure he won't remember. He will, I'm sure, remember Afghanistan. I meant me, Mr. Speaker. She's got vivid memories of Kabul at that time. We raise these issues with force, and there are consequences when there are sustained breaches of international humanitarian law, but I think, Mr. Speaker, it would be inappropriate for me to comment in too much further detail about how we conduct diplomatic relations on these questions.
So, Polly Billington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for granting this question, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend for all the hard work he is doing in these very difficult situations. The 8 members of the Knesset have penned a letter to the Israeli Defence Minister demanding that Israel destroy all sources of water, food and energy for Palestinians in Gaza. They argue that Israel should do to the rest of Gaza what it has been doing to the north. Will this government ban entry of these 8 Knesset members who are openly calling for the extermination of Palestinians in Gaza?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friends for the question and the kind words. As the House will be bored of hearing me say, we don't comment on sanctions measures in advance of taking them. To do so would reduce their impact. But I welcome the opportunity to provide a brief comment on the proceedings of the Knesset. There is much said in other parliaments with which we do not agree. We are clear the obligations under international humanitarian law and the diplomatic obligations fall on the Israeli government. So we are clear with the Israeli government what their obligations are under international humanitarian law. We are clear about our policy position. I will refrain, Mr. Speaker, from providing detailed commentary on the proceedings of another parliament.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, it's quite clear that Israel's ability to destroy life in Gaza and kill 45,000 people and destroy medical facilities is only possible because of the supply of weapons, principally from the United States. Can he be very clear? Is Britain going to continue supplying weapons, including parts for jet planes and the use of RAF Akrotiri, as a route for weapons to go to Israel that are destroying life in Gaza?
Mr. Speaker, in relation to... I want to be clear about the honourable member's asked in his question about fighter jets. In relation to the F-35 supply chain, where it is not possible to disentangle components which might eventually end up in Israel, there we have made a carve-out for the arms suspension. Where we are directly selling fighter jet parts, whether they are F-35 or other fighter jets, to Israel, those licences have been suspended. We will continue to have the same position in relation to the F-35 supply chain that has been discussed at this House at some length since it was announced in September. But we will, in relation to other fighter jets, take steps in accordance with the wider policy.
Yasmin Krish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Aid access is non-existent for Palestinians in North Gaza. The UN has made over 160 attempts in the last 2 months to reach the civilians in North Gaza with almost zero access. And we've heard that babies have been frozen to death. The Prime Minister in October said, "The world will not tolerate any more excuses on humanitarian assistance." So what further action have we done to ensure that the assistance does get to the people?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I have set out this afternoon, we have taken further action, including further funding in December for UNRWA. But I want to be straightforward, both with my honourable friend and with the House, that the further action we have taken has not had the effect that we would wish, which is clearly that greater aid reaches the Palestinians. Until we do see greater aid into the Gaza Strip, we will continue to take those efforts, however frustrating it may be.
We're Hamas.
Mr. Speaker, many of my Bath constituents are deeply worried about the intolerable suffering of the people in Gaza. But at this moment, they are particularly worried about the ban of UNRWA, which will come into force at the end of the month. And, Mr. Speaker, his previous answer to UNRWA is simply not good enough. Where is the urgency? Where is the urgency of doing something urgently about it, making an assessment what it means if there's no more humanitarian aid being delivered through UNRWA?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry my answers weren't to the member's taste. To repeat, this Prime Minister is the first Prime Minister ever to meet a Commissioner General for UNRWA. In December, we announced further aid. We have been clear privately and publicly, repeatedly, with the Israelis, with UNRWA, with the wider UN system, of the vital role. We are doing everything that you could hope in order to try and ensure that aid continues. Clearly, there is no alternative to UNRWA at the scale that it operates. It is not possible to substitute for their function quickly or easily, and indeed they are mandated by the UN to perform the function that they perform. This is not a welcome situation, and if we find ourselves this month in a situation where UNRWA cannot function, then I will say more to this House at this point, but I can reassure you, Mr. Speaker, and the rest of the House that we are taking this issue with the full seriousness that it deserves.
John MacDonald.
I think the Minister has expressed his frustration and distress. I actually think the Minister shares the depth of anger that most of us have in this House. We've witnessed over the Christmas period, when we're celebrating with our families, the scenes of children starving and freezing to death as a result of Israeli actions. The only solution, up until now, the actions that have been taken clearly haven't had the effect we wanted. The only solution that we've had in the past is a total isolation of a country, economically and militarily, to prevent them performing war crimes in the way that Israel has. I think this government could take a leading role in that isolation of Israel to bring it to some form of negotiated settlement. But can I just say one thing that grates with me in particular, is that we have an Israeli ambassador who's an advocate of a greater Israel, refuses to recognise the Palestinian state, defies all the UN resolutions that have been passed about how we can secure that peace, and she still remains in this country. Why aren't we expelling the Israeli ambassador?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his question, and I recognise the anguish in his voice about the scenes we have seen coming out of Gaza over the winter period, and he's right, I do feel that anguish as well. I think this whole House sees pictures of civilians in terrible distress and feels it too. I would say to my right honourable friend that he asked me about the Israeli ambassador. It is tempting to think that if only we had representatives more to our taste politically, then things would be easier. There is a disagreement, clearly. There is a disagreement between the British and Israeli governments about the conduct of the war in Gaza and the humanitarian implications that flow from it. We will continue to make that disagreement clear through all channels, both through the Israeli ambassador, directly to the Israeli government through the Foreign Minister, the Minister for Strategic Affairs, and the Deputy Foreign Minister, and we will continue to talk to the Israeli government about these issues. Indeed, that is the only direct route to secure the changes in the situation that we want to see.